Right. The 1 to 4 family paragraph, paragraph 7. Now, paragraph 7 has to deal with property condition. So we're going to deal with the condition of the property, disclosures on the property, acceptance of property condition, right? Lender required repairs, completion of repairs, environmental matters, residential service contracts. All of those things are going to be addressed here in paragraph 7. So let's get started. So paragraph 7A. Make sure you know what this is, but this talks about access for inspections and utilities, right? So look here, it says seller shall permit. That means the seller has to do this. According to the contract, the seller has to do this. Shall permit buyer and buyer's agents access to the property at reasonable times. Stop. Now, I want to point this out right here because it says the seller shall permit buyer and buyer's agents access to the property at reasonable times. So what that means is that the buyer does not need an inspection period to come into the property. They can come in to view the property. They can come in to inspect it themselves, to take measurements. Now, at reasonable times, part of that might mean they can't come in every day, but if they want access to the property, the seller has to make arrangements to get them access to that property, typically through their buyer's agent. Now, the second part here says the buyer may have the property inspected by inspectors selected by buyer and licensed by TREC. So that would mean a TREC licensed property inspector or otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. Okay. Now that could also mean electricians, HVAC guys, plumbers, right? Roofers, those people who are licensed or permitted by law to inspect to see if there's necessary repair, not necessarily just an inspector. Now notice it says the buyer may have the property inspected, again, meaning the buyer doesn't need an option period in order to get the property inspected. They can still get it inspected without an option period. That's not addressed here. So they shall have access, and they may, if the buyer wants, get it inspected. Now, the next part here is any hydrostatic testing. So what a hydrostatic test is that's when they're testing the sewage system by filling it with water and seeing if it declines over time, indicating a leak in the sewage system, which could be bad. If the buyer wants to do that, the seller has to authorize that, and there's an addendum for that. It's an addendum authorizing hydrostatic testing. So if you want to get that done, get it done. Now, side note on hydrostatic testing. Anytime the property has had foundation work, you want a hydrostatic test that was done after the foundation work was done. So if the foundation work was done, we need an engineer's report. And we would also want a hydrostatic test that was completed after the repair because it can move the joints and break pipes. If we don't have that, then you definitely want to ask the seller to get a hydrostatic test done. All right, that was a side note. Okay, now here's something else that people get wrong. The seller, at the seller's expense, shall immediately cause all utilities to be turned on and the utilities to be kept on until closing while this contract is in effect. So the seller has to have the power on and has to have water on, has to have sewage on. All utilities have to be on. If gas is involved, then gas has to be on. They have to be on to allow for inspections and to ensure everything is working the day of closing. The buyer will do a walkthrough. During that walkthrough, they should turn on the air conditioner. They should turn on the water and turn off the water right at the faucet. They should flush the toilets. They should turn on all the lights and such to make sure everything is working. And again, make sure that all of that gets done. Now, if an inspection is done, one of the things that sellers sometimes miss is make sure all the light bulbs are working, because if they're not working, the inspector assumes the light fixture is not working and they're going to write that up. So make sure all the light bulbs are replaced. Okay. So again, just a couple of things here that you don't need an option period to access the property or do inspections. You do need permission to go into the property, but the seller has to give you access. Okay. And if you want to get a static test done, you need permission from the seller in order to do that. All right.